Victorian England was a strange place. It was the center of the largest and most evil empire to ever exist. The British, in theory, could have plundered its colonies for nothing but the most delicious foods. Instead, they ate some horrifying things and plenty more bland things. And if today's diet supplement offerings seem crazy, just wait until you hear what the Victorians ate to aid weight loss. If you're eating food right now, then you need to stop. Welcome to Nutty History. Here are some foods you could expect to encounter in Victorian Britain. Imagine craving a nice meat dish in Victorian England, but work has been hard to come by, meaning that you have to cut cost. There's good news. Your local butcher has a huge cut of meat for a super low price. But there is a catch. The meat comes from an animal that died of a disease, like ringworm or tetanus. Do you risk eating this meat called broxy? This was the choice that many poor people in Britain had to face. As it was a time long before food safety standards, farmers and butchers were free to sell broxy meat from an animal that had died of something nasty and contagious. In the present day, thankfully, we can only imagine how this disease meat tasted. There was probably a lot of variance. After all, ringworm and tetanus are very different kinds of diseases. Some of it probably tasted very similar to normal meat if it was cooked well. But can you really cook away the thought that your meat comes from a filthy, unhealthy source? And let's face it, would the meat have been cooked well? Even today, the British barely season their food. Technically, broxy was any meat that came from a diseased animal, but the most likely source of broxy was sheep, as sheep were especially vulnerable to disease in Victorian England. You might be wondering how the Victorians could risk eating something that had a high likelihood of containing parasites. But it's not that surprising when you consider what the Victorians ate to help their diet. Fat diets are nothing new. You might think that keto or 5-2 is a crazy way to try and lose weight. Well, these diets were nothing compared to the tapeworm diet. This diet was just as disgusting as the name sounds. To be fair to the Victorians, it was pretty easy to follow the tapeworm diet. You didn't have to eat tapeworms 3 times a day or anything like that. Instead, you took a pill that contained a fertilized tapeworm egg. Then you waited for it to hatch in your stomach and hoped that your new belly buddy would eat up much of the food you ate before your body could digest it. Then, when a dieter had reached their target weight, all that needed to be done was to get rid of the tapeworm. Some people took more pills to do this, but others tried to lure the tapeworm out of the body, such as by placing a pint of milk nearby each orifice, waiting for the worm to inspect the drink, and then you would yank the worm out. What in the entire... And while this diet started in Victorian England, it still exists in some form today. In fact, the website Healthline has a medically peer-reviewed article that warns people that ingesting tapeworms could cause considerably more harm than good. Please, listen to this 21st century advice if you're considering giving the tapeworm diet a try. In modern times, some people refuse to eat veal because of what the calf has to go through before it's slaughtered. Well, in the Victorian era, an entirely different kind of calf dish divided people: boiled calf's head. This dish would often serve as the centerpiece of large feasts in Victorian England. Because what could be more appetizing than having a baby cow staring at you from the dinner table? There were also a number of popular ways to make boiled calf's head. For example, one method involved boiling the whole head, then taking out all the bones and then baking it. Another method specifically instructs people to leave the skin on but to scrape the hair off after 4 minutes of boiling. Many recipes also call for removing the calf's brain and using that meat to create another tasty dish. It's also absolutely possible to make this dish today, if you know where to look. After all, to make veal, you have to kill a calf, meaning that there are calf heads laying around somewhere. Sure, they're not sold in supermarkets and butchers won't be publicly displaying calf heads, but if you ask them, they'll probably sell you a calf head at a very reasonable price. Okay, this is definitely the least disgusting food on this list. In fact, if you were served this dish in the present day, your biggest complaint would be that it was bland. There were not many vegetarians in the Victorian era, which might be surprising to you considering you just learned about boiled calf's head. But there were some, and they had very little to work with. Most of the time, they just had to make vegetables that were available as the centerpiece of their meal. Cabbage pie perfectly highlights this. There are no prizes for guessing the main ingredient in cabbage pie. But many recipes show that a little more flavor was added to the dish by including onion, leek, potatoes, and cheese. These ingredients would have been boiled and then mashed together before going in the pie, meaning that the final pie would have tasted like it had been filled with baby food. The big downside of this dish is that it was mocked among Victorian meat eaters. In fact, the author of one British newspaper article dating back to 1893 pondered if there could be such a thing as a cabbage pie-eating prize-fighter. If it's a choice between a slice of cabbage pie or a slice of diseased Broxy meat, what would you pick? A couple who married in the 1860s could expect to have an average of 6 children over the course of their marriage. To make so many babies, these couples likely needed some kind of aphrodisiac. Oysters have been considered an aphrodisiac since the time of the ancient Greeks. So the wannabe horny Victorian couples just chowed down on oysters to get busy, right? Not quite. Without fridges, oysters tended to go bad quickly. The only way to preserve them was to pickle them. Luckily for poor Victorian couples who wanted to make babies, these pickled oysters were cheap. Sources from the time say 1 penny could buy you 4 oysters. 1 British penny in 1901, the last year of the Victorian era, is about the equivalent of $1.85 today. That means that 1 individual pickled oyster costs 45 cents in today's money. That's a better deal than oysters in today's restaurants. Many restaurants offer special deals for 1 oyster for $1. But then again, those oysters are fresh. So for the guys who are trying to get lucky on a budget, why don't you just whip out a plate of pickled oysters and wait for the magic to happen? We know what you're thinking. How can anything with a name like gruel be anything other than incredibly delicious? Despite the incredibly tasty name, gruel was one of the most basic meals of all time. It's basically oatmeal, but thinned out with water until it turned into something with the texture of slop. Gruel was basically the go-to food for Victorian workhouses. These workhouses were originally meant to be a solution for people who would otherwise be homeless. They would receive food, shelter, and basic comforts in exchange for labor. In reality, the workhouses provided the bare minimum they could while working its residents for as many hours as physically possible. Gruel's association with the workhouse has been immortalized thanks to Charles Dickens. In the book Oliver Twist, the title character is famous for requesting more gruel and being denied.
Please, sir, I want some more.
Yes, when Oliver says, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" he's asking for sloppy, gloopy, watered-down oatmeal. And scenes like the one where Oliver asked for food must have been played out all over British workhouses. That's because many parishes that owned the workhouses made it illegal for their residents to have second helpings of food. The great news is that this meal is the easiest to replicate on the list if you're looking to indulge in some Victorian poverty roleplay. To make the dish, simply make 16 ounces of oatmeal and water it down with 8 pints of water. Keep on boiling this until it has the sloppiness level that you want. All that's left is to serve it to your family or whoever you think would enjoy the meal. And yes, some people suggest adding treacle or allspice to make it more palatable. But this really goes against the Victorian workhouse principle of less is more. When British explorers returned from voyages, they were keen to share the incredible new discoveries that they had made. Food was no exception, and one of the most prized meats to come from this time was turtle. Turtle meat was considered to be especially delicious in soups. But for most people in the Victorian era, there was a huge problem. Demand far outpaced supply. So chefs had to get inventive and make something that would taste just enough like turtle soup to satisfy the masses. The ingredients in mock turtle soup often varied, and they were usually dictated by whatever the chefs could use at the time, including beef, oysters, and ham. But almost all mock turtle dishes involve one ingredient that this video has already encountered: calf's head. These recipes generally revolve around boiling the calf's head, but for longer than if it was being used as a centerpiece. Then chefs would use the water as a broth. Then they'd cut off as much meat from the calf's head as they could and add that back to the water. Sometimes they'd add the brain at this point, which would have been removed from the head before cooking. Did any of these mock turtle soups really taste anything like turtle? Probably not. But the people were told that it did, and that appears to have been enough for them. Who knows what they'd make of Linda McCartney or Morning Star Foods? So, what do you think? Does Victorian-era cuisine increase your appetite? Tell us in the comments. Hamburgers, mac and cheese, and pot roast. For good or bad, America has created its cuisine, which is both appetizing and affordable for most people. However, the same cuisine had its Precambrian expanse when the cooks did too many experiments with the food, and most of them were quite long, wide swings and misses. Today at Nutty History, let's go back to the 18th century to find out what crazy nutty dishes formed American food. Who doesn't love ham and bacon? These two pork products can be categorized as America's national food. But have you ever wondered what about the rest of the pig? Well, apparently our ancestors were quite thoughtful about not wasting any food. Introducing pork scraps. Yep, you guessed it right. The scraps of pork were typically parts of the pig that we throw away and consider non-edible. But for 18th century Americans, nothing was forbidden when it comes to food. Organs, tails, feet, they would gobble it all. Pork scraps was a dish that consisted of scraps of pork cooked with cornmeal. It was quite popular in mid-Atlantic colonies, and surprisingly, the dish has survived the passage of time. You might dismiss the notion of eating pig's organs and tail as a necessity of the time, but the dish still exists. Pork scraps is a favorite dish in mid-Atlantic states, and somehow California as well in present times. But now it goes by the name of scrapple. So if you ever had that and wondered, this dish has more texture than most pork dishes, now you know why. Who wouldn't eat beaver? Yeah, we kind of walked right into that one, huh? Euphemism aside, beavers are amazing and quite industrial animals. We know that they use their sturdy tail like a tool to build their dens and dams, but eating that tail isn't the first thought that would cross your mind. As the fur trade boomed during the 18th century, beaver meat became a popular game for the frontier hunters. It's hard to blame those fur hunters because beaver was indeed furry and provided a good and easy source of protein out in the wild. On another note, who's keeping track of protein out in the wild? Surprisingly, some people do eat beaver tail today, but in no circumstances would prefer it over other foods. Containing a lot of fat, beaver tail is food eaten out of necessity by voyagers and trappers. Squirrels were also considered a delicious meal among frontiers, but these bushy-tailed rodents were not new to the menu. Squirrels were part of the European diet, even in the Middle Ages, and their descendants continued eating them even after migration. Commonly, squirrels were singed, gutted, tied up, and then roasted. But some fancy cooks like to make pastries and pies out of them too. And just to make it weirder, the squirrel pie was served with a duck sauce. Sounds delicious, doesn't it? And if you think that is the wildest pie the 18th century had to offer, just keep watching to find out what we have next. Who remembers eels being a prominent gag in old-time cartoons, especially like Popeye the Sailor Man? No one? Guess we're getting too old for you, huh? But as much the thought of eating a slippery, slithery, half-fish and half-snake-like creature which electrocutes you like Pikachu might repulse you, eels were a common kitchen ingredient in the 18th century. The Colonials of New England states loved to make pies out of them. Shockingly, no pun intended there, the eels were caught using lobsters as bait. Today, lobsters are considered a luxury and an expensive meal, but back then, lobsters weren't so high on the seafood menu. Lobsters were, in fact, considered the food of the low-class workers and freed slaves, prisoners, and of course, eels. Even though eels were eaten in many ways back then, the pie was a fan favorite for some reason. Smoked eels is understandable, to a degree, but eel pie? All we can hope is that it never ever makes a return. No. That title card you read wasn't a typo. You might be thinking we're going to talk about some very early version or iteration of the tomato ketchup. But if ketchup and ketchup were related, tomato ketchup would prefer English. Ketchup was a distant cousin that nobody talks about in the family. In all seriousness, English ketchup still sounded like a progressive sauce on paper. Sources say that the recipe of this sauce was inspired by an Asian sauce, which makes you wonder why they would call it English. The ingredients include mushrooms, walnuts, anchovies, and oysters. That's a weird combination that could come with cautionary advice to not try at home. I mean, who thought this was a good idea? A lot of us have been a fan of Ninja Turtles in our childhood and would have dreamed about having them join us at a dinner table. But would you prefer to have them on the dinner table? Seems like 18th century people were fans of the turtles too, but not in a similar way. Turtle soup was a popular dish among the posh and wealthy colonials and the rich at the other side of the pond. That is, Britain and France. They shared the same opinion. Traditional turtle soup was cooked in lots of butter and wine, making it a very heavy dish perfect for lunch and dinner. Even today, snapper turtle soup is an established part of the Philadelphia cuisine. But beware, as ignorance in what turtle you use to make soup can give you food poisoning, or worse, salmonella. Ever heard of roti sans perel? No? How about that one weird turkey you once tried on a trippy Thanksgiving dinner that you still regret? Yep, we're talking about turducken. Turkey stuffed with a duck, stuffed with a chicken. Now imagine the same awful dish with 17 layers of bird inside it. This awful Russian doll version of birdception had to be made with an exact order of birds. Starting from the inside, it went like this: warbler, bunting, lark, thrush, quail, lapwing, plover, partridge, woodcock, teal, guinea fowl, duck, chicken, pheasant, goose, turkey, and lastly, the giant bustard. Whew, that's a lot of birds. Now you all know the Frankenstein story. A crazy scientist tried to sew up parts of various dead bodies to create his own pet monster. The novel by English author Mary Shelley was written in the early 19th century, and maybe this 18th century dish could have served as inspiration. In mythology, cockatrice is an abomination of a monster that has the head of a rooster, the wings of a bat, the body of a pig, and the tail of a lizard. The cooks of the 18th century decided to emulate this mythical beast by sewing the top half of a boiled rooster to the bottom half of a suckling pig, and then the creation would be stuffed and roasted. Certainly the inventor of this not-so-appetizing dish didn't care why they shouldn't when they could. The dish had a slightly different name from its mythological counterpart and was called cockatrice. Let's just feel relieved that they left out the wings of a bat and tail of a lizard. Certain honorable mentions must be made before we end this appetizing video with a list of desserts. Cock's ale was an ale brewed with a crushed boiled rooster. Badgers were used as pork substitute. And obviously the most popular ones, roasted male sheep genitalia and roasted cat. One of the most desirable and expensive desserts of the 18th century was chocolate mixed with ambergris. What's ambergris, you may ask? It was an expensive and elite additive people added to their dishes in the 18th century. This is quite interesting, as this substance, ambergris, looked like a stone, felt like wax, and smelled like marine feces. Why, you ask, did it have such a peculiar odor? Well, because ambergris was in fact dried vomit of a whale. And for some reason, 18th century Americans found the combination of vomit of a sea mammal and chocolate quite rich and delicious. I think I threw up in my mouth a little. Ugh. And those who could not afford this lavish delight resorted to having a calf's foot for their after-meal sweetness. Because what could be tastier than a cow's offspring's feet? Calf's foot jelly was created by the gelatin that would appear when boiling the hoof. Originally, it was believed that calf's foot jelly was good to heal sick people. Thankfully, medicine came along, and calf's foot jelly was long gone from the menu. However, if you enjoy eating Jell-O today, you are eating gelatin derived from boiling various animal bones and skins. How willing are you to try these amazing 18th century food trends? And do you think we missed any other interesting ones? Tell us in the comments, and do not forget to like and share the video. Egypt, with its majestic pyramids, is among the top travel destinations today. But let's go back in time to see what Egyptians were fed to build these breathtaking pyramids. Due to the geographical location of Egypt, the Nile River flowed through the ancient city, allowing for the farming of crops and livestock. Trade between countries also allowed Egyptians to enjoy a multi-ethnic cuisine. So, among all the ancient civilizations, Egypt ate better than most did. But this doesn't mean that all food was finger-licking good. Today on Nutty History, we'll show you some pretty weird, or some would say gross, food choices ancient Egyptians made. The kind of food and the amount that people ate in ancient Egypt varied depending on their wealth and social position. Now, because of that, peasants and enslaved people had a limited diet. Usually it consisted of fruit, vegetables, fish, meat, and sometimes even something exotic. However, being rich or not, Egyptians would enjoy the delicacy of a rodent fillet. Could you imagine catching a mouse in your attic to actually eat it? Sounds delicious. Not only did they eat the meat from the mouse prepared in various ways, but there is also evidence of using it for medicinal purposes too. To be precise, ancient Egyptians used mice as a food treatment to cure, as it is believed to be called, excess salivation in children. So to conclude, a mouse a day keeps the saliva drool away. If your palate was not feeling the rodents, next on the menu we've got hedgehogs. No, not Sonic the Hedgehog. We bet you're wondering, though, just how they could do that. Oh. People of Egypt were familiar with two species of hedgehogs, the desert hedgehog named the Paracinus aethiopicus and the long-eared hedgehog named the Hamerichius auricius. Their importance to ancient Egyptians is figured through the fact that they made hedgehog amulets and painted images of them in some Old Kingdom tombs. Speaking of images, they were usually represented in hunting scenes or as an offering, even in the form of a hedgehog ship, with ships having an image of a hedgehog's face on their hulls. An example of this ship was discovered at Tel Ibrahim Awal in 1993. All in all, there are interpretations that a hedgehog was a symbol of rebirth, or in other words, rising from the dead. It is believed that it is because they retreat into their dens that are underground when there is hardly any food, and they reappear when they sense food. But this all didn't stop ancient Egyptians from eating them. They were considered a wild game and were actively hunted. To be ready to consume, it is assumed they were coated with clay and baked in the fire. The use of clay is also assumed because it would adhere to the spikes, and once cracked open, it would remove the spikes with it too. Try to rise from the dead after that. But we still can't wrap our heads around how someone could do this to a hedgehog. I mean, they're just so cute. When we think of pigeons today, we imagine them leaving a present on our newly washed and polished cars. Oh, the rage. Many of us today think of them as dirty urban pests, but could you imagine eating one? Pigeon keeping itself is a tradition that is even older than ancient Egypt. Evidence of pigeon husbandry are references found in Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets and hieroglyphics that are more than 5,000 years old. So, back in ancient times, pigeons held an important role for ancient Egyptians. They were used as messengers by the Egyptian army, and as an announcement of the arrival of incoming ships. To get to the point, not only did ancient Egyptians build pigeon towers and breed them for domestication purposes in order to use them to carry messages, but also to eat them as well. Some may say they lived a purposeful life back in the day. The traditional dish that is still eaten today is called hammam mashi, and it consists of a pigeon stuffed with seasoned rice or cracked wheat and then fried in butter or grilled. Make mine lemon pepper, please. The saying, killing two birds with one stone, sounds kind of appropriate here. Pelicans are large water birds that mainly eat fish. Now, Nigel, the pelican from Nemo, would disagree on that one, but rumors say they taste like oily fish. To be precise, people say they taste like fish that's been left out too long. A bird that tastes like fish. Yucky fish. Ew? At least one would assume such a thing considering how much fish they eat. You are what you eat, right? Perhaps ancient Egyptians' taste buds were slightly different than ours, or shall we say limited, because that does not sound tasty at all. Evidence says it did not stop them, and they indeed enjoyed pelican meat and their eggs, which also tasted rather fishy. How they prepared it, though, is unfortunately not exactly documented, although it is suggested to cook them longer in order to diminish their peculiar taste. If you are not a fan of the smell of fish, imagine the smell of rotten fish. Pretty traumatic if you ask us. Well, ancient Egyptians ate fish. Plenty of fish. Lots of fish. Obviously because they had the Nile River right under their nose. As you can tell, these guys, well, they really like fish. They ate it in any way possible. One of those ways is called fessic. It is a traditional Egyptian dish that originates back to ancient Egypt, where it was found sealed in jars in Egyptian tombs. Fessick consists of fermented, dried, and salted fish. As if dried fish doesn't sound bad enough. In short, fermentation is a process of chemical change that happens with the help of microorganisms. Because of the process of fermentation, Fessick has horrific, and for some, even a life-threatening equation. Now, tell us, who gagged on this one? Or better, who didn't? Now, just to be clear, beware of Fessick today. There have been cases of poisoning reported every year because of an incorrectly prepared dish, and its symptoms include abdominal cramps, constipation, nausea, vomiting, or, pay attention, even death. Life-threatening indeed, and not just the smell. So you adventurous, opportunistic foodies watching this, yes you, we suggest you think twice before implementing that YOLO attitude with this one, unless you have a death wish. Imagine being force-fed in order for your liver to get plumpier and juicier for someone to consume. Did that make you uncomfortable? Well, for thousands of years, there's been the practice of fattening geese or ducks. Its origin can be traced back more than 4,500 years. It was the fresco painting discovered in an ancient Egyptian tomb that proves the history of this procedure. Ancient Egyptians noticed that there was something delicious about the liver they ate from geese and ducks at the time of them preparing for migration. Poor things, it seems like the joke is on them. Instead of a long journey through the sky, they travel through the intestines. At least, their liver did. Anyway, they achieved that by gorging themselves at that time of the year, the time before migration, which creates a big surplus of fat on their liver. Quite interestingly enough, it was a natural instinct. They know they need that energy stored so they can live off of it during their journey. Because hey, who goes on a trip hungry? Unlike us, they don't have backpacks with snacks in them to take for their flight. So by observing that phenomenon, ancient Egyptians tried to replicate the process. Now, according to history books, Egyptian slaves were the first who force-fed figs to the geese. And there goes the freedom of choice. Today, as a huge part of French culture, the method is called gavage. It is a process of feeding the duck with a tube and then massaging its neck to assist with swallowing. Inhumane or not, that's the question. We just hope they did and still do it gently. Egypt is located on the African continent. During ancient times, the climate pretty much resembled that of today. It was only the area close to the Nile River that was inhabited because the country was filled with sand deserts and the climate was dry and hot with minimal rainfall. Ooh, we got thirsty just reading that. Now, due to weather conditions, people of ancient Egypt had difficulties keeping meat fresh and edible for extended periods. You see, once the animal was slaughtered, they had to either consume the meat immediately or somehow preserve it for later use, usually with lots of salt. But because of the lack of refrigerators and hot climate, they had a harder time doing it, especially the poor. So if they happened to be late in eating or preserving the meat, but decided to eat it anyway, despite it being not so fresh, ooh, imagine the smell. It is believed they used lots of different spices and even more salt because they had to cover the smell and the taste. The moral of this little history lesson is to be thankful for Oliver Evans because he was the inventor of the first refrigerator in 1805. Now tell us, have you tried any of the food mentioned, or are you willing to try any? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like and share the video. A lot of us picture Native Americans eating turkey, squash, and corn with the Pilgrims on Thanksgiving. But the reality is that Native American diets have extraordinary variety and have for millennia. Food played and still plays an important cultural role for Native Americans when it comes to ritual and spirituality. And a lot of it just seems tasty. From highways of kelp to the first North American sausage to a mango-like fruit you'd never guess grew on the East Coast, here's what the Native Americans eat. Seminole Alligator Wrestling. The Seminole tribe of Florida is the only Native American tribe to never have signed a treaty with the U.S. government. They're known as the Unconquered because of this, but after successive wars with the government that lasted into the 20th century, they were pushed farther and farther into the Everglades, and farther into alligator territory. The Seminoles have been hunting alligators for thousands of years, long before Europeans ever made it to the continent. One of their alligator hunting techniques is called fire hunting. From a canoe, one hunter would take a burning torch and thrust it into the eyes of an alligator while his partner would put a spear through it. If you couldn't blind and stab the prehistoric Floridian beasts, you might have had to wrestle them. Alligator wrestling was a pretty important part of Seminole culture. It was a way to capture them and then breed them, a better, more sustainable option than just stabbing them with a spear while they were being blinded by a torch. Once the alligators were caught, they'd traditionally be taken to the cookhouse, a raised platform with a high roof made of bark or reeds, similar to the houses they lived in called chickees. They'd expertly butcher the gator, paying special attention to the tail meat and the ribs. Since gator meat tends to be tough, they'd often tenderize it by pounding it with a hammer. From there were a few ways to cook the meat. They would roast it over a fire, or fry it up in a pan, or even braise it in a stew. You can find all kinds of alligator recipes these days, a lot of them inspired by the Seminole. By the 1900s, Seminole alligator hunting morphed into what can only be described as a tourist attraction. Europeans driving down to the fast-developing Florida coast would see Seminole people struggling with 10 to 15-foot dinosaurs on the side of the road and want to stop and take the 1950s version of a selfie. As the years went on, it morphed into a whole industry of people paying to see Native Americans dressed up in traditional garb fighting alligators for sport instead of sustenance. Tiswin, booze from corn and cacti. Down in South America, the Inca made something called chicha, a beer made from fermented corn that was used in ritual ceremonies for millennia. Go down to Cusco today and you can still buy a bottle of it at the market. But less is known about the ritualistic practices and uses for alcohol in North America. But the Pueblo, the Apache, and some other tribes seem to be making their own versions of chicha up north. And there's evidence they were doing it long before Columbus ever came to the Americas. Let's think about it this way. If you have a surplus, a stockpile of something like wheat or corn, eventually some of it's going to spoil. A lot of cultures kept their stores of grain or corn in clay pots. In these humid and warm storage conditions, the grains would often come into contact with airborne yeast that would end up fermenting the sugars in the wheat or corn. And voila, beer. Oh, beer. Agriculture is said to have popped up independently in a few different places. There's still debate on if and when there was any overlap, but Mexico and Central America was one of those independent regions where the earliest evidence for agricultural practices dates back 7,000 years. It figures in that with all the corn they were growing, someone along the line figured out how to turn it into booze. The Apache, a Native American tribe known for their nomadic lifestyle across the southwestern U.S., also have a history of producing tiswin, a weak fermented beer that most likely evolved alongside the development of agricultural practices in the region. They would take maize kernels and submerge them in water until they sprouted a little and then mash them up, sweeten them with mesquite flour or saguaro syrup, and then left to ferment in clay pots. The Tohono O'odham tribe in the Sonoran Desert would make their tiswin from the saguaro cactus, the towering, sometimes 30-foot tall cactus you see in postcards of Arizona. They would pick up the fruit of the saguaro in June, dry it, boil it down to a syrup, then stick it in a clay pot until it was time for their saguaro festival, when they would take the syrup, mix it with water, and let it ferment into their own version of tiswin, a tiswin that was more like a wine. Wonder if that's even good. The use of tiswin in ceremonies and rituals among these tribes predates European colonization. Back in 2007, 800-year-old pieces of pottery from an ancient Pueblo site were found with distinct traces of tiswin. Tiswin was used in blessings and prayers to ancestors and spirits. It was used in important rites of passage and in healing ceremonies as a way of purification. Navajo tacos. If you saw this, what would you think? Some type of taco, right? Maybe from Mexico or South America? This is actually a Navajo creation, maybe a bit tricked out and taco-like than the original though. The story behind Navajo fry bread is a fascinating and tragic one. Known as delicacies, or something close to that in the Navajo language, fry bread is made from a couple of simple ingredients and deep fried, making it look a bit like a taco shell. So the recipes you'll find online that look like flat tacos piled with beans and guac and other Tex-Mex style fare. The origins of fried bread are intertwined with the history of Native American reservations and challenges faced by indigenous communities. The creation of fry bread is connected to a painful period in Navajo history known as the Long Walk of the 1860s. During this time, the Navajo people were forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands in what is now Arizona and New Mexico to Bosque Redondo, a reservation in eastern New Mexico. This forced migration resulted in limited access to traditional food sources and the imposition of government rations, which included flour, lard, and salt, the ingredients in fry bread. Using the ingredients they had available to them, Navajo women basically invented fry bread as a way to feed their families. They combined flour, lard, salt, and water to form a dough, which was then shaped into discs and fried in hot oil or lard. The result was a simple and versatile bread that people could eat in tough times. Fry bread quickly became a staple in Navajo cuisine and spread to other indigenous communities across the United States as well. It adapted and evolved to reflect the cultural and regional differences of each tribe. And who doesn't like a good taco? So there you go. It's really fascinating how food and diet is connected to culture and migration. Traditional Native American cuisines have had deep spiritual significance. They've been practical reactions to injustice. You know, some foods like kelp might have been a key reason they came to North America in the first place. And of course, a lot of them have simply been delicious. Viking milk and European contact. Did the Vikings make some Native Americans sick by giving them milk? According to the Nordic Vinland saga, they might have, and I bet you never heard of this one. In the saga, a group of Norse explorers led by Leif Erikson landed in North America, in a mysterious place called Vinland. During their exploration, they came into contact with the local indigenous population, whom they call Skraelings. The exact identity of these indigenous people is a bit of a mystery, but many think they must have been Native Americans. In part 1 of the saga, the Vikings established a trading relationship with the Skraelings. Part of that trade included milk the Vikings brought over with their cows. The Skraelings apparently marveled at this new white liquid. If, in fact, they were Native Americans living on the northeast coast of North America, then they most likely didn't have any domesticated animals, so no milk. The natives drank the exotic liquid their new neighbors gave them, but the problem was they were lactose intolerant. The ability to digest any kind of milk other than your mother's when you're an infant is a biologically inherited trait, a trait that the Vikings and a lot of Europeans had, but one that the Native Americans didn't. So they got sick and blamed it on Viking witchcraft, or if not witchcraft, then Viking bad intentions. The Native Americans attacked the Vikings, and there were a lot more natives than Norse. Milk could have contributed to the fact that the Vikings were not able to stay longer in the New World. Sick, angry Skraelings could have driven them out after a well-intentioned drink gave them stomach cramps. Pawpaws, America's secret fruit. What if I told you there's a fruit that grows all along the east coast of the U.S. that tastes as if a mango had you-know-what with a banana and a lime? You might be surprised to learn that the tropical taste and result can be found growing on trees in the woods of upstate New York, or Georgia, or Missouri. Imagine a band of Native Americans wandering somewhere on the East Coast a couple thousand years ago. They've identified a lot of plants that are good to eat and a lot of ones that were fatal. Blueberries, delicious. Hollyberries? Well, Bob ate too many of those and he's no longer with us. It's late August, and this band stumbles upon a grove of medium-sized trees with this fruit the size of a hand and shaped like a big lima bean. One of the natives cuts open the fruit and takes a whiff. It's like nothing he's ever smelled before. One taste, and he's hooked. The pawpaw might be the most delicious fruit you've never heard of. Often referred to as the poor man's banana or the custard apple, the pawpaw has a tropical taste that resembles a mix between mangoes, bananas, and a splash of citrus. And it wasn't brought to the East Coast from somewhere more tropical. It's native to the region, and its range even extends into the Midwest. The pawpaw tree is a smallish tree that grows in understory forest and moist, well-drained soils. It produces big, greenish-yellow fruit with a custard-like texture, which are harvested in late summer and early fall. Native American tribes have a long history of eating pawpaws, with evidence of its consumption dating back thousands of years. The Native American tribes Sioux and Osage ate them. The Iroquois would mash them up and make little cakes. The Pawnee even had a pawpaw month marked off on their calendars. Despite its rich history and unique flavor, pawpaws still remain a mystery to most people, including the people who live in places where the fruit could literally be growing in their backyard. So go and check your backyard after this video. Still, there's a growing interest in recent years among some farmers to cultivate and promote pawpaw trees for their unique fruit. Local communities and farmers markets in areas where pawpaws naturally grow have become popular places to find pawpaws and, in doing so, reconnect with a forgotten indigenous past. Kelp Highway. One of the most important foods for Native Americans might have also been part of the reason why people came to North America in the first place. Seaweed snacks might be pretty popular now, but nearly 16,000 years ago, seaweed could have really been all the rage. The Pacific Northwest is home to massive underwater kelp forests. This kelp can grow up to 175 feet tall, and it provides a home for a whole slew of marine animals like fish, shellfish, seals, and otters. Kelp itself is super nutritious, and people all over the world have been known to eat it. The question is, did Native Americans migrating from Siberia eat it as they traveled along the coast in small boats before there was an ice-free corridor along the Bering Land Bridge? Proponents of coastal migration theory argue that early human populations, aka Native Americans, could have used kelp and the marine life it nurtured as they migrated south along the coast from Siberia. They think these populations may have developed seafaring skills, constructed simple boats, and navigated along the coastline using the kelp forest as a navigational aid and as a source of food during their journey. One key piece of evidence supporting this theory is the presence of early archaeological sites along the Pacific Northwest coast and further inland. One of the most compelling sites is Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, where spear points have been dated to 16,000 years old, about 3,000 years before there was an ice-free corridor for people to walk across into North America. Cooper's Ferry is on a river that feeds into the Columbia River, which feeds into the Pacific Ocean. Farther south, there's also an archaeological site called Monteverde in Chile, which dates back around 14,500 years. These sites indicate that humans were present in the Americas earlier than we thought. And if they couldn't have walked over, coastal migration might have been how they did it, and kelp likely helped feed them along the way. What other cultures' eating habits are you interested in? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. French monarchs and nobility are remembered as perhaps one of the worst ruling classes in history. And that is saying a lot. As the majority of the French population starved, the French nobility lived lavish lives and ate some of the most exquisite foods to exist. King Louis, otherwise known as the Sun King, was so fond of extravagant and rich dishes that he would make an exhibition of his dining. Welcome to Nutty History, and today let's peek inside the court of Versailles to find out what they were serving in those fancy dinners called the Grand Couvert. The desire to peek into celebrity life is not something that started on television in the 90s, but it goes centuries back. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was famously known for his eating, and he was so proud of his appetite that he would make a spectacle out of it. The Grand Couvert was a ritual in which the king and queen ate their dinner in front of members of the public. And the Grand Couvert was not called grand for no reason. The menu consisted of a huge collection of 20 to 30 dishes. According to his sister-in-law, Princess Palatine, the king had an insatiable appetite. I mean, he could eat 4 bowls of soup, a whole pheasant, and a partridge, and a large plate of salad, and then 2 slices of ham, plus mutton au jus with garlic, a plate of pastry, all followed by fruit and hard-boiled eggs. Woo! Do not go in there. Man, this must be like having Thanksgiving dinner at Mama Joe's every other night. No wonder Louis XIV died immensely overweight and had his left leg turned gangrenous. Ew. Truffles are considered a luxury delight because they're hard to find, frustrating to grow, and impossible to store for any length of time. But they also are mind-bogglingly delicious and aromatic, which makes them worth it. However, there was a time when French aristocrats would not eat them over their dead bodies. As truffles grew in the ground, the elites did not consider them worthy of the upper-class dinner tables and shunned truffles, calling it peasant food. But then it all changed, with Louis XIV's love of all kinds of food. Poached truffles became an important part of dinner, and even Marquis de Louvois included them in his banquet of 1690. Only a year after that, Francois Massielot, one of the star chefs of Versailles, revolutionized already delicious croquettes by stuffing them with truffles and cream cheese. Bon appetit! If you are hungry and you want to dine in, you might want to make reservations. Cakes, Pastries and soufflés are all delicious treats on their own, but when they were made for the French royalty, they had to be more than just desserts. When Louis XV married Polish Princess Marie Lashinska, she brought the famous Polish chef Nicholas Strower alongside her to Versailles. Nicholas introduced France to the baba cake, and the whole royal court went gaga over baba. What was his secret ingredient, you might ask? You are asking, aren't you? He was soaking those otherwise standard cakes in the finest of wines. Mwah! The 18th century brought a new craze for delicate foods among the aristocrats, and the many-layered Mafia became common among royal dining. Pastries consisting of multiple layers of not only cake, but jams and creams were quite trendy back then. While Louis XIV was in love with food, his successor, Louis XV, was infamous for chasing women. According to his sister-in-law, his standards were so low that anyone would do for him, provided she is a woman. On the contrary, there was Queen Mary Lashinska, devoted to developing and enriching the French cuisine according to her sweet tooth. One of her inspirations, turned into a dish, is bouchée à la reine, which translates into a queen's bite. Broken down, it essentially is a savory pastry with chicken and mushrooms. She was also responsible for bringing meringue to France, a dish which was a favorite of her daughter-in-law, Marie Antoinette, as well. Meringue. Please, don't ask me to share. Louis XV's mistress, Madame Pompadour, was dining on a bird's stomach somewhere, and she was not alone when it came to eating quirky. The cookbooks in that era consisted of weird foods which were a fad back then. French elites in the 18th century loved to shock their guests by serving novelty foods, just to get a reaction. They would cook bizarre combinations, like chicken and lamb bladders, and goose liver filled with fat. What in the entire chicken fricassee is going on there? Imagine, you sit down to eat dinner and there's a baby cow snout poking from the dish at you. Or you were hoping for oysters when you heard they are serving seafood. And instead, snail's rubbery cousin, Winkle, slithered its way onto your plate. Tasty. This weird trend of the 18th century is why today French's cuisine proudly serves pig's feet and ox's tongue as exotic and decadent food. There's a lot of pigs going around in wheelchairs because they can't walk because they ate their feet. Someone say TikTok reel. Perhaps the world is lucky that the French didn't have TikTok back in the day, or else who knows how far that ridiculous trend would have gone. Marie Antoinette had a bit of a sweet tooth. She too brought a chef like her mother-in-law when she arrived at the French court from Vienna. However, her chef was no pastry chef. He was a chocolate chef. Her love for chocolate was hardly unique, but given that chocolate was a treat reserved for the wealthy, she enjoyed it quite exclusively. The chef came up with many now famous chocolate concoctions for Marie Antoinette, but nothing beats the delicious hot chocolate with orange blossoms. It might sound weird, but surprisingly, it is noted to be quite refreshing. But Mary wasn't the one who introduced France to delicious, succulent, luscious chocolates. That credit goes to Anne of Austria, Queen of Louis XIII, and mother to the Sun King. The Sun King himself was responsible for making consumption of chocolate popular among Parisian nobility, and turned chocolate into a habitual feature of Versailles cuisine. Marie Antoinette's father-in-law, Louis XV, also preceded the Queen's love for hot cocoa. He was so fond of it that he would not even wait for servants and go to the kitchen to make it himself. His mistresses, he had more than one, shared his fondness of chocolates as well. The king truly believed in the aphrodisiac powers of the tasty treat, and he fed his lovely ladies a lot of desserts to get some hot, lovely relations. Mary was not just fond of chocolate, she's also responsible for making Dom Perignon, a known name among the champagne connoisseurs. Shall we propose a toast? Her New Year's balls were incomplete without bottles of Dom Perignon champagne. Mary threw dinner parties, and let's just say they were the craziest parties the world had ever seen. So, what do you think? If you could go back in time, would you party with Marie Antoinette? Let us know in the comments. Now, go eat something. And thanks for watching Nutty History. Food and culture are inseparable and have been for millennia. Food has shaped trade routes. It started wars. It helped bring peace. Ingredients have been mashed together in ways the maddest of mad scientists would raise an eyebrow at. Here's some of the strangest food that didn't quite conquer the world in the way rice or potatoes did, but had an impact on the entire world in their own right. 100-year-old egg, anyone? How about a whole goat stuffed with rocks? Psychosis-inducing honey that helped defeat the Romans? Are you hungry yet? Century eggs. China has a long, rich culinary history. One of its strangest dishes has a name that does that history justice. The century egg isn't for the gastronomically unadventurous. Around 500 years ago, it said a farmer stumbled across some duck eggs sitting in a muddy pool that happened to be mixed with slaked lime or calcium hydroxide. When he cracked one of the eggs open, he found that it was basically hard-boiled, except that the egg white took on a translucent, jelly-looking amber color. For whatever reason, he decided to take a bite. He was hooked immediately. It was savory with a distinct umami flavor that was almost meaty. And he needed more. The farmer went on a mission to replicate the process. First, he coated some duck eggs or quail eggs with a mixture of that slaked lime and water. He probably didn't know it at the time, but the alkaline coating was essential for raising the pH of the eggs and kicking off the preservation process. Once coated, he wrapped the eggs in a layer of rice straw, which allowed air to circulate around the eggs while preventing contaminants from entering. He then stuck them in a clay pot and filled it with a mixture of clay and water, sealing them in. He let them sit for a couple of months, and voila, the century egg was born. The technique has been replicated and honed ever since. Century eggs are a delicacy in China, and while it doesn't take 100 years to make them, they certainly look like they could be that old. Mad honey. When the Greeks and then the Romans tried to invade the people along the Black Sea coast of modern-day Turkey, they were met with a secret weapon that they didn't see coming: honey. In 67 BC, General Pompey led a Roman army into the kingdom of Pontus, led at the time by Mithridates IV. It's said that just before Pompey and his army approached the key city, Mithridates' men lined their path with juicy bits of honeycomb. Hungry legionnaires gobbled the stuff up, and soon they were hallucinating. They were sick. They were falling down. They were dying. Mithridates' men came through and routed the tripping Romans. Almost 400 years earlier, a Greek army led by Xenophon of Athens was traveling back along the Black Sea coast after winning a battle against a Persian army. When they stopped near the city of Trabzon, they found some beehives filled with honey and sat down to have a feast. Again, hallucinations, vomiting, disorientation. Xenophon wrote later that the Persian army caught up with the tripping Greeks and took out 1,000 of them while they were debilitatingly high. The honey the Romans and Greeks ate is called mad honey for obvious reasons. There are different types of mad honey around the world, but this one is only found in the Black Sea region of eastern Turkey. It's made when bees pollinate certain rhododendron flowers that contain a neurotoxin in their nectar. Eat a bit and you'll feel a slight buzz and maybe some hallucinations. Eat too much and you could die. You can still buy the stuff if you're ever in Northeast Turkey, but it'll cost you. It's the priciest honey in the world at $166 a pound. Plus tax. There is always tax. First ever hot chocolate. When Christopher Columbus returned to Europe after his fourth trip to the Americas in 1502, he brought a bunch of stuff back with him. Among the bags of gold and silver were some strange beans that nobody thought much of. Just a few decades later, they'd become one of the biggest culinary game changers in European history. They even changed Christian doctrine. The Aztecs considered cacao beans divine. They were the physical manifestation of Quetzalcoatl. They even used them as money. When the conquistadors came through, they were not too excited about the cacao drink they were given, which was usually mixed with chili. Imagine that, chocolate and chili. But in 1521, Hernán Cortés brought the drink to Spain, added some sugar, and gave it to Charles V. It was a hit. Chocolate grinders, or molinderos, started grinding up the beans into a paste and making a thick cocoa drink. Monks and monasteries started making and consuming the stuff. It became such a hit that it sparked a major theological debate in Christianity about whether drinking the chocolate drink violated fasting rules. Catholic Cardinal Francesco Maria Brancaccio, maybe a chocolate lover himself, finally gave a definitive answer in the 1600s, decreeing once and for all that liquid does not break the fast. Thick, hot cocoa became all the rage among European aristocracy. Women in church drank it to keep themselves awake during long sermons. It became so common that the Catholic bishops started banning it from inside holy walls of their churches. Garum the Great. Putrefied fish guts don't seem like they'd make a good sauce. They don't seem like they'd make a good anything. Ugh. No, I'd rather not, thank you. But a fish concoction that's as extinct now as the dinosaurs actually helped shape the Roman Empire. Garum was kind of similar to the fish sauce that's still hugely popular in many Asian cuisines. It was made by fermenting the guts of small fish like anchovies or mackerel with salt in huge vats. The fish guts were layered with salt and left to ferment for a few months. As gross as it sounds, the fermentation process allowed enzymes and bacteria to break down the fish into a savory liquid. Garum was the most popular condiment around in Roman times. It could be eaten straight as a dipping sauce or drizzled over dishes. It was also a common ingredient in Roman recipes, adding depth and umami flavor to stews and sauces. Garum was so popular in ancient Rome and demand was so high that it helped drive the creation of major trade networks throughout the empire. Coastal cities like Pompeii and Ostia were built around fisheries and fish processing factories dedicated to the production of the fermented fish guts. In a way, you could say the Romans built their coastal empire by following the migration patterns of anchovies and mackerel. It also helped that they had one of the fiercest and well-trained militaries in history. And I'll tell you right now, Augustus loved the stuff. Bird's nest soup. High on a cliff in the mountains somewhere in China, there's a man poking around at a bird's nest. He's risking his life to get one of the most valuable and sought-after foods around. But he's not looking for an egg to make into a century egg. He wants the nest itself. Bird's nest soup is made from the nest of swiftlets. These small, knife-like birds secrete a sticky, gel-like substance from their salivary glands to build their nest. What basically amounts to their spit, then hardens when it's exposed to the air and forms the nest structure. Once the nests are harvested, and hopefully the man on the cliff doesn't plummet to the afterlife, the bird's nests are cleaned and soaked in water to soften them up and remove bits of feathers. The softened nests are then simmered in a gentle broth, often chicken or clear soup, until they become tender and translucent. Bird's nest soup has a long history in traditional Chinese medicine and is considered a valuable tonic. It's thought to have quite a few health benefits, including helping with digestion and boosting the immune system. But wow, it's expensive. Only the rich can afford the strange soup. One famous lover of the swiftlet spit was Empress Dowager Cixi, who effectively ruled China from the late Qing dynasty into the early 20th century. Apparently she ate the delicacy on a regular, and even stockpiled bird's nests to make sure she had a steady supply. Deadly but delicious. There are certain plants and animals that can end our lives pretty quickly if we eat them. You can imagine a hunter-gatherer talking to his friend, warning him not to eat that mushroom because it killed his Uncle Frank last week. Yet some toxic foods have been eaten anyway. One of them is the pufferfish, or fugu in Japan. The Japanese have been eating the highly toxic fugu for millennia. Their bones have been found in settlements from the Jomon period that date back 2,300 years. There was definitely a point early on when people didn't know how to prepare it properly, which meant for lots of people it might have been their last meal. But the fact that people kept preparing it and figured out how to without dying meant that there was probably a pretty serious food shortage at some point, and if you're left with little to eat except a toxic fish, then you either adapt or perish. Fugu contains a lethal neurotoxin that doesn't have any known antidote. The neurotoxin accumulates in the liver, ovaries, and skin. But if you're skilled enough to carefully remove all that, you're left with a delicious sushi delicacy that's high in protein. It's thought fugu was originally used for medicinal purposes, but during the Heian period, which lasted from 794 to 1185, it became a staple at the dinner tables of the elite class in Kyoto. However, in the early 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate made it illegal to prepare the pufferfish. It was basically one of the earliest versions of a Food and Drug Administration type decree, saying, "This is not fit for consumption." When the Meiji Restoration rolled around towards the end of the 1800s, Japan started regulating fugu more. You now have to go through some pretty rigorous training to get a license to prepare fugu in a restaurant. All that effort certainly pays off for the restaurant goers, though. The presentation of some fugu dishes is mesmerizing, and the taste is really, wait a minute, I got one more, really good. Mongolian Bawdug. The Mongols had more than a few victories along their way to conquering nearly the entire Eurasian continent. And to celebrate, Genghis Khan was known to throw lavish banquets and chow down on one of Mongolia's long, meaty culinary traditions. Mongolian armies travel light. Cooking pots were heavy and too burdensome for an army that prioritized speed and efficiency over comfort. So they often had to prepare their food in more creative ways. Bawdug was one of those ways. The Mongols usually cooked whole goat, marmot, or whatever other animals they had around while they were traveling to different regions throughout the steppe, China, and Eastern Europe. First, they would split the animal open and remove the organs, which they'd prepare separately. Then, the Mongolian butcher would carefully remove the meat, cut it up, maybe add veggies if they had any available. The skin and fur of the animal was carefully left intact, and then the meat is stuffed back inside the carcass along with hot stones. The whole thing is then spit roasted over the fire, cooking the animal from both the outside and the inside. No pots necessary, the goat or marmot became the crockery. Feeding what would become the largest contiguous land empire in history was no small task, and the efficiency of Bawdug was a key part of helping the Mongol armies gallop from the Mongolian steppe into China, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Thanks for watching. What other bizarre food traditions do you want to learn about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nutty history. What do soldiers eat? What did soldiers eat? These are some questions that many fans, including myself, want answered. Horse milk and meat, bread, and protein bars thicker than a brick, mummified cows, and literal dog food. These are actual foods that were either part or all of the military ration provisions over history. We live in a time when science has made food more available, long-lasting, and more delicious than ever. And we must thank armies worldwide for the advancements in food preservation, culinary innovation, food packaging, and bioengineering. But to make this possible, what kind of sacrifices did men and women of the military have to make? And no, the dog food wasn't one of those sacrifices, but we're going to talk about that later. Welcome to Nutty Productions, and this is what food was, is, and would be like in armies around the world.
I guess I'm in. When do we eat? Well, what's your hurry? All you get from now on is beans.
Army food is no longer a matter of beans and guesswork. Since the last war, nutrition has become a science, and our Army Quartermaster Corps uses that science in planning Army meals.
Napoleon Bonaparte is considered one of the finest generals in the history of mankind. Now, some would argue that Custer was the best general, except for, that little bighorn thing. Napoleon had a strong belief about the connection between food and success. He's famous for the saying, "A military marches on its stomach." Yet several historical records, anecdotes, and one journal from a Napoleonic foot soldier prove that Napoleon's men had to pillage or buy their own rations. Now, let's be fair about this. It is also quite possible the quote was actually said by Prussian monarch Frederick the Great decades before Napoleon was born. Whoever may have said the quote, it does have a strong impact on the philosophy of modern armies across the world. When soldiers go out in the field today, they carry tiny miracles of modern bioengineering. Not the weapons and protective gear, even though they are wonderful innovations in their own way. I'm talking about MREs, or the meal, ready to eat. A soldier needs about 4,000 calories to complete their duties and training in a day without costing too many taxpayer dollars. Now, on top of that, they need this much food in light and easy to carry packaging that is still edible after days and days in the hot sun, or in flooded rivers, or on cold mountains. They can't take a gourmet chef with them, but thanks to a lot of sciencey tricks and techniques, they can take quality food everywhere in the form of an MRE. And when I say gourmet, it is not always the fanciest kind of food, but the people who made it possible have done their best to accommodate the cultural and geographical taste of various countries around the world.
With the Second World War came the sharp realization that a man in the army is as good as the food he eats. Came too the new thinking that if the army needs balanced feeding, so too do the workers. That with new food limitations arising out of the war, the question of proper feeding demanded serious attention.
Australian armies are able to take their Marmites and Vegemite tubes everywhere in the world, no matter where and for how long they're deployed. Spanish soldiers, they still get to eat oil squids with green beans and ham. German soldiers get rye bread with goulash. Estonian armies enjoy chicken pate with their ration packs, and Italian soldiers love to have a shot of grappa. A great based aperitif, because who doesn't like to feel a little buzz before performing the most stressful and intense job in the world? And then there is a certain incident of dog food being distributed to their soldiers. But let's not get distracted. All of this became possible because of MREs. They were first delivered to the U.S. Army in 1981 in dark brown outer bags. Now, the technology has been evolving ever since, allowing the storage of more and more kinds of food in small packets that soldiers can carry and keep with them during active duty.
Tucked away in a small army base in Natick, Massachusetts is a large industrial kitchen. But it's not there to manufacture food. It's there to develop the meals that fuel soldiers on battlefields anywhere in the world.
And with the arrival of the internet, these brown bags of food, or MREs, are no longer a military secret. You can now buy them on Amazon, put a camera in front of you, and record yourself eating them to upload reactions and reviews on YouTube. And not just videos. U.S. soldiers and veterans maintain ranking pages and forums and vlogs dedicated to MREs. Now, according to these rankings, chili and macaroni, or chili mac, and chili and beans happen to be super popular among active soldiers and veterans alike. In fact, the MRE craze on the internet has gone out of the bounds of reality, and people are now coming up with their own themes for MREs, such as rations for apocalyptic scenarios where a zombie contagion has run over the world and every man is fighting for their own lives. So if there's ever a case where you find yourself fighting World War Z, or humanity depends on you as you are the last of us during the dawn of the dead, you know where to look to keep yourself fed while fighting for survival in a future zombie land to survive the night of the living dead. Just pop one of these sustainable ration bags open, and each of them will have enough food to keep you fed for 24 hours. As they say, don't fight a zombie on an empty stomach. One soldier described the experience. As the entree heats up, I sit back and help myself with the pepperoni combo snacks, the cornbread, and the vegetable crackers with cheese spread. Afterwards, I eat my entree. Fire! Southwest-style beef and beans, or simply a beef stew, are also another popular choice among American troops. This one seems like an underappreciated hidden gem because it's not widely popular, but those who like it really appreciate it for its consistency. And then there is the country captain's chicken. Now that is the most coveted MRE. It's so much desired that in fact it could be considered contraband in the military. People have jokingly offered each other services to trade their MREs for their colleagues' country captain's chicken. They're willing to give their own food along with a dubious proposition for that one. So let me try some of these MREs. Without the indecent proposition, of course. Now this is what a package of an MRE looks like. It comes with 2 dinners. This one has lentil stew. The other is beans with tomato sauce. Now also included in the pack is a peanut butter pack, a strawberry jam pack, a strawberry Pop-Tart, 2 packs of crackers, a shortbread cookie, a fig bar, a bag of seasoning, a spoon, and a napkin. Right now I'm going to try the lentil stew. Doesn't look very appetizing, but let's see what it's like. You know, that's not really bad at all. Yeah, this is not too bad. I could be having fun with this, I'm just saying. Yeah, okay. Now let me try the beans with tomato sauce. Beans and tomato sauce, huh? Well, let's see how this one goes. Let's see. I'm not feeling this one. This one tastes like the devil's ass. I'm just going to say it's not that good. The lentil one, yes. This one, let me give it another shot here. No. I'll have the lentil, though, and I'll have a Pop-Tart on my own. Just saying. Not bad. Not the best, but not bad.
But complaints about the food are a daily staple.
Terrible. It's all around terrible.
It's delicious.
It sounds good, though.
It is good.
It's not good.
Yeah? On a scale of 1 to 10, how is it?
3 or 4.
You know MREs sometimes get a bad rap.
No, I don't know that.
The sheer fact that there are clear favorites among both vets and active duty soldiers should tell you that not all MREs are created equal. The entrees cycle in and out through the years, but can include jambalaya, pork chow mein, and spaghetti. Side dishes range from fruits and veggies to trail mix. Bread and crackers come with peanut butter, cheese, or jelly. Desserts? Well, that could be anything from brownies to cookies to pound cakes. Drinks can be coffee, juice, or tea. Extras like condiments and seasoning are sprinkled in as well. But the variety is not just limited to contents. There is a stark diversity in the taste as well. Now, when we told you chili and beans are considered the best MRE around, we were talking about how popular they are among those who had to eat them. These recommendations are from the end customer, not some food scientist or a dietitian. So keep that in mind when we talk about the not-so-popular MREs. Apparently, there is one MRE that is considered so nasty that people compare eating it to a death sentence. And no, we're still not talking about that dog food. Yet. From 1993 to 2000, the Frankfurter's beef menu number 6 was considered a menu item that was perhaps created by somebody as despicable and evil as Amy Dunn from the movie Gone Girl. Encased in an airtight plastic pouch, these 4 hot dogs wreaked havoc on the bowels of the U.S. service members everywhere. So much so that the soldiers christened them 4 Fingers of Death. Don't ask. These salty hot dogs came in a similar length to an average-sized human finger and usually plopped out of their packaging with an unappetizing brown pinkish sort of liquid. Ugh, as if they were giving you the finger. The MRE would also have a packaging of Western beans as a compliment, hoping that soldiers could create an ambiance of an authentic weekend barbecue even when they were in the barracks. But in reality, the cooked meal was so detestable that it earned its own entry in the Urban Dictionary. According to most who have tried it, along with the reviewer on YouTube, the 4 Fingers of Death was a complete disaster package. Even the fudge bar included as dessert was rated abhorrent. The Western beans were soaked in a tomato sauce that was mediocre at best, and the apple jelly with crackers was the only redeeming factor of this MRE. There's really only been one other MRE that came this close to being universally hated among the servicemen and women. They call it the Vomlet. The MRE's infamous nickname was actually a portmanteau of its real name, veggie omelet. Those who ate it said it had all the flavor of cold scrambled eggs and all the texture of dried paper mache. A food that is surprisingly avoided at all costs by military personnel is reported to be beef enchiladas. Now, usually beef dishes are favored, but enchiladas are shockingly an exception to this rule. The strange texture and flavor have been cited as a reason why most service members would try to barter it off for something they could stomach at least. And enchiladas aren't the only beef item among MREs that were widely unpopular. The dehydrated beef and pork patties that were in circulation about 3 decades ago. Wait, that's not the 80s, that's the 90s. Man, I'm getting old. Ooh. Anyway, not to sidetrack, these dehydrated patties required rehydration, and the directions for it were no less complicated than a science experiment conducted by a junior high school student. The plastic bag in which the patty was stored had to be filled with water, and then it had to be put out in sunlight or something until it looked ready to be eaten.
What I'm going to do is not to dry to the total dryness, right, to the semi-moist stage, but still shelf stable.
And this is different from freeze drying.
Oh yeah, freeze drying, you cannot do that. You have to either dry it totally or otherwise it's gonna spoil. But the microwave, because it's a uniform drying, it's possible to dry to the stage.
But again, these foods were still meant for human consumption and not dogs. Yes, we're talking about literal dog food cans. No matter how good food preservation, processing, and packaging have become over the years, especially in the last century, history has witnessed a fair amount of belly aching from all generations of soldiers. But this story is a little different.
Russian troops were fed dog food earlier this year to save money, it's being claimed. Labels reading premium quality beef covered up the real canine-destined contents, according to this video footage shot by a whistleblower. Igor Matveyev says he was ordered dismissed after posting a video on the internet alleging widespread corruption in the Interior Ministry forces.
In spring 2011, Major Igor Matveyev posted photos and videos online revealing that the cans of premium quality beef being served to troops posted in the eastern city of Vladivostok were in fact cans of dog food plastered with bogus labels. The Interior Ministry denied Major Matveyev's accusations, and for his troubles, the determined whistleblower was stripped of his rank for maltreating his superiors, along with being sentenced to 4+ years in prison. Since then, nobody involved in the incident has talked about it, or even if the dog food was any better than the human food.
Unrepentant and rule book in hand, he reads, "A serving soldier finding illegal use of army property or improper spending of its finances or misuse of its weapons, inadequate storage conditions and other factors that could damage the interests of the Russian armed forces has the right to appeal to the regional court, the authorities or public bodies."
In September 2018, food engineers accomplished a massive feat. They added a special pizza to the 24 available MRE options. Now, pizza is love. Pizza is life. We all cherish pizza, and so do people who sit on the front lines. So, pizza MRE's inclusion has been considered a genuinely good move to raise morale and battle something called meat fatigue. And that got me thinking, what could have been the revolutionary pizza for armies of the ancients? Mesopotamians, for example, the early civilized bunch who pretty much arguably invented agriculture, had a very minimalistic approach to the military rations. They gave their soldiers barley, oil, and wool. Wool? Were they supposed to eat it like noodles? Egyptians, on the other hand, allowed their soldiers to carry whatever they could to the battlefield. But like many other things about the modern world, the term rationing began with the Romans. They were the first ones who allotted a specific amount of food to every soldier. It was the purest example of necessity as the mother of invention, because a Roman legion consisted of more or less 5,000 men, and to feed such a large army in the days with minimalistic preservation and pretty much no refrigeration meant they had to cook dozens, if not hundreds of animals to meet the calorie needs of the cavalry, and infantry as well. This was a problem until the 20th century. Romans also punished their insolent soldiers by replacing wheat with barley in their rations. And Romans, along with their successor, the Byzantines, had soldiers carry hand mills to grind their grains and probably make paxamathia. Mongols ate their horses. Washington's army had to rely on embalmed beef, which was basically a mummified cow without the wrappings. And during the First World War, there was a huge shortage of nitrate fertilizers with not many other options to exist. So during the Second World War, American GIs had two major types of rations. C ration was meant for combat troops, and the K ration was the less bulky version of the C ration that was initially developed for airborne regiments and messengers. There was also an A ration and a B ration and a D ration. A ration was mostly fresh or frozen food that the military cooks prepared in base or field kitchens, and it was served in proper Army dining halls. B ration included canned and dehydrated food that didn't need to be refrigerated, but also had to be prepared in the kitchen by cooks. Now, the C ration, often called C-rats, were designed for individual combat troops and consisted of pre-cooked food in tin plate cans that opened with a key.
The combat ration C, which I have here, a box, is designed to take care of a man in combat for one day. Let me show you the contents of this box. There are a total of 8 cans. 3 cans of basic menus for each meal. For instance, corned beef hash, meat and beans with tomato sauce, hamburger with gravy, and a can of fruit, in this instance, pineapple. Now there are 4 other cans, and they contain the following. Here, matches, cigarettes, soluble milk, coffee, sugar, a can opener, toilet tissue, chlorine tablets, chewing gum, and again, of course, a plastic wrapper.
Initially, officials calculated that C rations would only be consumed for no more than 3 days at a time and produced just 3 varieties. The D ration was basically the earliest prototype of a protein bar, a heat-resistant fortified chocolate bar intended to provide high energy in a small package that soldiers could carry in a pocket. But the soldiers called them molar breakers because they were hard to chew. These rations, designed to provide 3 meals and approximately 3,600 calories each, were almost universally unpopular. Later, soldiers would get powdered drinks like lemonade and bouillon, and eventually they got sweetened cocoa. K rations would include breakfast, lunch, and dinner with 4 ounces of meat and or eggs, cheese spread, biscuits, candy, gum, salt tablets, and a sugary drink. There were also cigarettes, a wooden spoon, and toilet paper. From 1958 to 1981, the U.S. used MCIs, or the Meal Combat Individual Rations, which were precursors to the MREs. A full ration could be bulky, so troops often disassembled it, taking what they needed on patrol by placing cans into socks that they could tie to their packs. In Korea and Vietnam, MCIs were distributed to combat soldiers in a cardboard box, which contained 1,200 calories through a can of meat that could be ham and lima beans, or a turkey loaf, a can of bread, which could be crackers or hardtack or cookies, and a can of dessert, like applesauce or sliced peaches or maybe a pound cake. But of all these items, the hardtack bread perhaps has the most interesting story behind it that goes back hundreds of years. One of the Roman breads, called bouchulum, which they borrowed from ancient Egyptians, was in use until the 20th century. In modern times, bouchulum is known as the hardtack bread, and it's known for longevity.
And so governments everywhere began a new campaign for better feeding, a campaign urged on by the needs of war, asking the cooperation of managements to investigate the eating facilities of the employees and try and improve them, asking the cooperation of the men themselves to take new note of what they are eating.
Hardtack bread has an exceptionally long-lasting life. If stored properly, these bad boys can last about 25 years. During the civil discourse of 1861 to 1865, the Union soldiers complained that the hardtack bread they were being fed was the leftover bread from the days of the Mexican War that happened 15 years before the civil discourse. During the Crusades, the bread was known as the muslin biscuit. The Golden Age pirates called it the sea biscuit, and during the Great War, it was known as the molar breakers because of how hard it is supposed to be. It is made with salt, flour, and less water than usual breads and baked long enough that the moisture will evaporate, and that hardens the bread to the point that it won't rot. In the book, Combat Ready Kitchen, which by the way is a great read, author Anastasia Marx de Salcedo mentioned that the going stale clock on freshly baked bread begins the moment you pull it out of the oven. It happens because of a starch called amylose. Strands of amylose start spreading all throughout a bread structure the moment it is pulled off heat, making the bread get harder and harder by the minute. But amylose has a nemesis called amylase. Amylases are enzymes that are usually denatured by heat as the bread cooks. And that is why a baguette feels like a razor on your gums if you eat it many days after. In the mid-20th century, food scientists at Kansas State College discovered that we can artificially add amylases that stand up to heat, and that changed the equation of food preservation forever.
The age-old process that Grandmama learned from her grandma to give us our daily bread, the staff of life. Only now, we've made our bread better and even more hygienic. Small loaves take 30 minutes to bake, and large loaves take 7 minutes longer.
The amylases 2.0 here are enzymes that come from a heat-tolerant bacteria, and they keep the bread almost eerily soft and flexible, giving it a longer shelf life. Because Kansas State's college research was funded by the U.S. military, their new bread made it into pouches in military rations and eventually in the supermarkets near you. Almost all bread in grocery stores today has bacterial amylases, working to keep it squishy for the long term. You can also thank military research for packets of dry active yeast as well for this marvel. You ever wondered how a cheese cracker can stay in its packaging for months without cheese drying out and the cracker losing its crispiness? It's been made possible by keeping the levels of water activity the same for both items and not letting the water migrate between the two. A moist food is a much friendlier place for bacteria and mold than a dry one. You can try it at home. Put some brie and a brittle corn chip next to each other, and you can easily guess which one would give in first. But a watermelon, which is 92% water, can also outlast brie by miles. So what gives? Apparently, it's not the moisture content that determines the age of the food, but rather how many water molecules are floating around unattached to anything else. They are the spoiler alerts that spoil your food. We all know that salt and sugar are natural preservatives, but how do they work? Well, I don't know. Oh, I can find out by reading this, right? Because salt and sugar tie up the water molecules without making the food go dry. But with pasteurization, food scientists have managed to make modern food hostile to life. That is, microbiological life. This is a huge leap from the 19th century when soldiers had to boil their maggoty bread and coffee to kill vermin. Back in the day, Napoleon's government put a lot of resources and effort into developing food preservation. One of their biggest achievements was canning, but then back then they used sealed glass jars. Their efforts, though, paved the way to define modern food as we know it today. Without all this science, we wouldn't have preservative-free lunch meats, fresh-tasting juice and milk, and avocados that stay green under their wrapper. Pretty much more than half of our supermarkets would be empty if it wasn't for military rations. So yeah, even if Napoleon was only repeating what Frederick the Great said, he was correct and he made a significant contribution to the cause. So thanks, Napoleon. And thank you for watching Nutty Productions. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and share to support our channel and subscribe to watch more Nutty videos.